Hello, everyone. In this video, I'm briefly going to be talking about David Hume and his understanding of skepticism. All right. And I could talk about this for hours, so I will try to keep this short. Okay. So, first of all, some general ideas that Hume agrees with about empiricism, and then others that he would like to qualify. All right. So, David Hume falls in line with other British empiricists like John Locke and George Berkeley, but Hume is going to have some pretty profound disagreements with both John Locke and Berkeley. Okay, so first of all, Hume generally agrees with the idea that we do not have direct access to objects and events in the world. So, to the extent that we think that there could be an external world, objects and things like that, which exist independently of our minds. Part of Hume's skepticism is that we can't really possess knowledge of what the real world is really like. Okay, and what Hume is going to do is he's going to restrict his attention, his sort of skeptical outlook, to what he calls local matters rather than global matters. All right, so what would be the difference? So Rene Descartes' skepticism is a global type of skepticism. So Descartes doesn't only question whether or not the seemings, the seeming perception of reality is accurate. Um, Descartes thinks in order to show that the perceptions that we seem to have about reality are accurate, we need to prove that our actual powers of knowledge, our powers of observation, and our powers of reasoning are accurate in their own right. Hume does not think that this can actually be done. He thinks that this kind of skepticism is self-defeating. We really don't have a choice in the matter, but to form beliefs on the basis of what appears to us to be the case, or form beliefs on the basis of our reason and things like that. Now, but where Hume thinks we can make a correction here is in how far we want to extend our powers of knowledge. So, what Hume advocates as a skeptical outlook is just a certain kind of humility. What Hume thinks we need to do, and this is where he thinks philosophers like Descartes and other rationalists make a big mistake, philosophers usually start with questions that they find interesting, and then they try to find answers to those questions. Um, Hume thinks that this kind of gets the equation backwards. What we need to do first is examine what our actual powers of knowledge are, the kinds of powers of knowledge that we actually are or actually possess, based on the kinds of things that we are. So when Hume talks about a science of human nature, this is exactly what he is referring to. We need to figure out the kinds of questions that, given the kinds of beings that we are, given our actual powers of knowledge, we should figure out what kinds of questions we are even fit to have answers for in the first place. And then we should let our questions flow from this understanding of what our actual powers of knowledge are. So a lot of these complex philosophical questions about mind-body relationships, about causation, about God's existence, about necessary connection in the world, about miracles in the afterlife, about ethics and sort of objective accounts of what is good and all these kinds of things. Hume thinks that these are just far beyond our reach. So Hume's skepticism operates from the premise that when we actually examine our powers of knowledge and we see what kinds of questions our powers of knowledge are actually fit to have answers for, we will find that most of our philosophical inquiry is largely pointless, given that these kinds of questions are just well beyond our scope. So if we're going to do philosophy, let's keep it restricted to appropriate boundaries based on the kinds of things that we are. So Descartes he's got a much grander project here. Descartes says, no, 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 no. We need to be able to show that our powers of reasoning and our powers of observation and our powers of belief formation are themselves reliable. Hume will say, well, whether they're reliable or not, whether the beliefs that I form about the world correspond exhaustively with respect, to having certain knowledge of a world that exists independently of my mind, that's not the kind of thing that I can know. That is just well beyond the scope of my knowledge. So Hume embraces skepticism. He does not think of skepticism as sort of a negative term of endearment here, which in Christianized Europe, the last person you want to be is the doubting Thomas. But uh, Hume embraces skepticism. He owns the label of being a skeptic. So, as one historian of philosophy says, the fact that Hume self-identifies as a skeptic means that he thinks that this term does not do any violence to his character. As far as Hume is concerned, skepticism is the way to go here. Okay. Now, other qualifications that he's going to make. He's going to say that all of our useful knowledge is derived by experience, where other empiricists are just going to talk about knowledge being derived by experience. Hume has this somewhat of a corrective here, talking about knowledge which is useful and then knowledge which might be somewhat trivial. Okay, now, but like John Locke, Hume also thinks that questions about relationships between the mind and the body and questions about what constitutes a substance, these are open to empirical inquiry. Okay, now, but where he's going to find grounds to disagree with John Locke is in a relationship between sensation and reflection. Okay, so as a representationalist, John Locke makes a distinction between something that we acquire by sensation and then something which is just an idea of fashion. Okay, now, and based on that distinction, Hume is going to say that all of our ideas are themselves sensations. All of our, or I guess I said perceptions here, but all of our ideas are themselves sensations. So there's no distinction between having an idea of something and having a sensation of that thing. Okay, I'll talk more about that momentarily. All right, and then as far as our language goes, Hume thinks that what our concepts do linguistically, meaningful concepts are those things which communicate sensations. Okay, so for any word that we are going to employ, whether it is a specific name or kind of a general term, so here Hume agrees with Berkeley about, for lack of a better term, he's a nominalist about common names or common terms. So, when we say the word red, we're not referring to a property that individual objects have in common. Red is just a general term that we use linguistically when perceptions or sensations resemble each other. Okay, so the nominalist who denies the existence of universals is going to say that our sensations and our perceptions can resemble each other without having anything in common. So when I say this object is red and this object is red, I'm using the term red linguistically kind of as a heuristic device. But the fact that I'm saying this object is red and this object is red and these are not the same thing, if I take it straightforwardly, it looks like I'm making a metaphysical assertion about, well, so if this object is red, as this object is red, there's something, redness, that two objects have in common. Both Berkeley and Hume agree that that's not actually what we are doing. What we're doing is we're saying, okay, the sensation I have when I look at this object resembles the sensation I have when I look at this object. So they resemble each other. And linguistically, that's all I'm doing when I say this is red and this is red. So metaphysically, this does not imply, according to both Berkeley and Hume, that there's a further property, redness, or a universal red, that these two objects actually have in common. So the nominalist is going to say you can have resemblance without commonality, and still to this day, contemporary philosophers are debating about whether or not that's true. Non-nominalists are going to say, okay, but the best thing that explains resemblance is commonality. So if you believe in universals, you believe that there are properties or attributes that distinct objects can have in common, you have an explanation for why they resemble each other. Okay. Now, Berkeley thinks that the reason why distinct objects resemble each other, this has to do with sort of God's ordering of the world, if you will. It has to do with the active involvement of our soul, mind, spirit, and clearly the sort of unifying active spirit, the ultimate unifying active spirit, which is God. So God and God's activity is what explains resemblance in the world and sort of order to the world. Hume leaves this question open-ended. Yeah, so do distinct things resemble each other? Sure, but do we know what it is exactly that explains the resemblance of these kinds of things? No, we don't. So Hume would say we know nothing about the world besides our own ideas and sensations, and those ideas and sensations resemble each other, but there's really nothing that explains that resemblance. Now, Locke, as a representationalist, thinks that the best explanation for resemblance is the fact that mind-independent substances are endowed with what he calls powers or dispositions. Okay, so when I look at one object and I see that it is red, and I look at another object and I see that it is red, what these objects have in common is the power to produce a red sensation. So the red only exists in my mind, right? So redness is a secondary quality. However, for Locke, the power to produce a red sensation, that is a primary quality. So the power to produce a red sensation, according to Locke, that is in the object itself. But the redness only exists in the mind of the conscious perceiver. So for Locke, resemblance of things in the world, the reason why distinct things in the world resemble each other, why when I look at one white wall and then I look at another white wall, they resemble each other, is because they both have a power. So powers to produce sensations, these are just in the external world themselves, right? And that's a major component of John Locke's understanding of representationalism. Berkeley and Hume both disagree with this. Berkeley and Hume both disagree with this distinction between the primary quality and the secondary quality. Okay, now, but as far as our language goes, Berkeley and Hume also agree that the fact that we use general words to sort of capture resembling sensations or resembling ideas under a common category, the fact that it's a common category is just a linguistic device. So the fact that we make things easier by categorizing them, it's a mistake to think that our linguistic categories correspond to facts that are actually in the world. It's a major mistake to think that because we divide the world up into a nice taxonomy of categories, that those categories themselves correspond to facts or actual states of affairs and objects in the world. That is a mistake. We have no grounds whatsoever to say that, says Hume. Okay, now Berkeley is going to disagree. Okay, well, why is it that the world appears to me to be a certain way? Well, because the world is exactly the way that it appears, right? If I have direct access to the world, and the only thing that I have direct access to are ideas, well, that means that the world is entirely constituted of ideas. That explains why I have direct access to things in the world. Right? Okay. And I can't switch slides. What's going on? Oh, hey there. Let's go back. So where does John Locke go wrong exactly? Okay, so John Locke, again, has this distinction between primary and secondary qualities. So primary qualities of things are bulk, figure, and motion, and number, and the dispositions, the actual powers that an object has in itself. The secondary qualities, these are the subjective conscious perceptions. Okay, so again, what explains why human beings have perceptions in common is because human beings have the same kinds of powers of observation, and objects in the world have the same kinds of powers to produce certain kinds of sensations. Okay, now, so for John Locke, his argument for why our ideas of things are dependent upon experience is, he says, okay, but if we notice that somebody lacks a certain observable power, whether it be sight or hearing or taste, um, or you know, touch, those kinds of things, we notice that they lack certain kinds of ideas. So a blind person has no idea of color. You know, all people who have been blind from birth have no idea what color is. All people that have been deaf from birth have no idea what sounds are, right? Okay, but that must mean then that these kinds of ideas are acquired wholly by experience. And Locke just says, I suppose that would be the case about all of our ideas then. Okay, so what Hume's problem is here, and Berkeley's problem, is that, okay, we only get an idea of secondary qualities by perception, by sensation, but our ideas of primary qualities are also dependent on sensation. Okay, so if both the idea of a secondary quality and the idea of a primary quality are both dependent upon experience, then why do primary qualities get to be in objects themselves and secondary qualities don't get to be in objects themselves? So Berkeley and Hume will both say, all right, either both kinds of qualities are wholly in the mind and not in the object, or both of them are wholly in the object and not in the mind. And Berkeley and Hume both agree that the qualities, the ideas, they exist entirely in the mind, right? They exist entirely in the mind. Now, so Berkeley's argument that, okay, well, if we're talking about primary qualities, we're talking about qualities that things would have independently of whether or not they're being perceived. So, you know, if a given object in the world is a mind-independent object, well, that means that it has certain qualities independently of whether or not anybody is perceiving that object. Okay, but what is that? Okay, so if all qualities of things are sensible qualities, regardless of whether they are primary or secondary, if all of our understanding of qualities in the world are sensible qualities, what would it even mean to say that an object has sensible qualities that are not sensed? So the very nature of a sensible quality or a perceptible quality is to be sensed or is to be perceived. So this is purely ad hoc, John Locke. You know, you can't say that all of our knowledge is dependent upon experience, and yet we have knowledge of qualities that things have independently of experience. Why? If there were such a thing as primary qualities or powers that things have independently of our perception of them, well, we wouldn't have any access to these kinds of things by experience. The objects would have these qualities independently of whether or not they are experienced. Now, but if all of these qualities correspond to sensation, or sensible or perceptible qualities, the very nature of a sensible or perceptible quality is to be sensed or is to be perceived. Okay, now, and this cuts into his understanding of representationalism. So I get a perception of reality, and then I say, okay, but this perception of reality is best explained by objects that are in the world and the powers that those objects have. Hume says, but this is just a promissory note. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to establish a necessary connection between the perception that I have and a mind-independent object in the world. Now, but how could such a necessary connection be established? So if my perception of a white wall when I look over here is explained by the presence of a power, an intrinsic power that that wall has to produce a sensation of whiteness within me, and every time I go and look at the wall, I say, oh, it's white again, it's white again, it's white again. So the fact that I have a repeated observation, right? The fact that I have a repeated observation does not establish a necessary connection. So in order to establish that, the reason why when I look at that wall, it appears to me to be white, the reason, you know, in order for me to say that is explained by an actual power that the object has intrinsically, regardless of whether or not I perceive it, I would have to be able to get to the bottom of that power. Now, but given my powers of observation, I can't get to that power. Okay, now, and furthermore, what I can't do, says Hume, is I can't extend a collection of past experiences into the future. So the fact that every time I look at that wall, it appears to me to be white, if the whiteness of the wall, my perception of whiteness, is best explained by the intrinsic power of the wall to produce white sensations, if that's the best explanation, then that means that every time I see the wall, it will be white. Now, but how can I extend that past experience into the future? So how do I go from every time I have looked at the wall, it has been white, so every time I will look at the wall, it will be white? I have no basis whatsoever for doing this. So what I'm doing is I'm making judgments about what I haven't observed based upon what I have observed, and that is a mistake. I can't make judgments about what I haven't observed based on what I have not observed. So, psychologically, what does this mean? Psychologically, the fact that my mind creates patterns to make sense of the world, or the fact that on the basis of repeated observation, I form certain psychological habits. Once again, the fact that I form certain connections between objects and events, and the fact that I form certain psychological habits and expectations on the basis of repeated observation, the fact that it's a habit of mine to make those connections does not mean that there are actual connections between objects and events in the world. Or more importantly for Hume, the fact that I create connections between sensations and ideas, it doesn't follow that there's a necessary connection between the sensations and the ideas. So the sensation of looking at the wall and the sensation of being, having a sensation of white, yeah, every time I look at the wall, these two things are strongly correlated with each other. So every time I look at the wall, every time I have a sensation of looking at the wall, I also have a sensation of white. So my mind establishes a connection between those two things. But again, just because my mind establishes a connection between these two things, it doesn't follow that there's an actual connection here in the world. It would be a big mistake to make that assertion. Okay, and furthermore, with respect to the nature of abstract ideas and substance, so Locke thinks that if we examine a particular, we can abstract kind of a general idea of what that thing is. So you can have knowledge of the abstract and knowledge of the particular. So use the example of a tiger. If I observe a particular tiger, I'm observing everything that all tigers have in common. So basically, if you've seen one tiger, you've seen all tigers with respect to what it is exactly, the features or properties or attributes they possess that makes them tigers. So if I observe one tiger, I do get all of the qualities that all tigers have in common in that one experience of that one tiger, regardless of whether or not I know it. So I can abstract from that the general idea of what a tiger is. Okay, but if you think about abstract ideas, and again, Berkeley makes the same argument. So to have an idea of a tiger in abstraction, it couldn't be possibly a particular exemplar of a tiger. Why? Because it's abstract. Okay, so there's a sharp distinction here between the particular and the abstract. Nothing that's abstract is particular, and nothing that's particular is abstract. Okay, so John Locke would say, I have this abstract idea of what a tiger is, but that abstract idea of a tiger is not a particular tiger. Now, but when you think of tigerness, the abstract idea of what it is about tigers that makes them tigers, what do you picture in your mind? A tiger. Okay, so aren't you just picturing a particular tiger? Yeah, right? So even if you try to just, don't think of a particular tiger, just think of the abstract idea of a tiger. Well, when you think of the qualities that all tigers have in common, the nature of the tiger or the essence of a tiger, in your mind, you just picture a tiger. Now, but that tiger you're picturing in your mind, that is a particular tiger. Okay, now, so this is why Hume says all of our ideas are themselves sensations. So to have an idea of a thing is just to have a certain kind of sensation of that thing. So you can't take away the essence of a tiger from a particular sensation of a tiger. So everything is particular here. Okay, now, and what is a substance? Okay, well, John Locke has this kind of generic understanding of substance. He's a corpuscularian in the same way that Rene Descartes is. So John Locke's understanding of substance is it's kind of a generic bearer of properties. So a substance is whatever you are left with when you remove all the particular sensible qualities away from a thing. And again, this is where Berkeley and another area where Berkeley and Hume agree with each other. Okay, but if you picture anything, right? So, picture a particular red apple, all right? And then start removing its sensible qualities away one by one. So take away the color of the apple, take away the shape of the apple, take away the weight of the apple, the taste of the apple, the juiciness of the apple, the tart flavor of the apple, the crunch of it. Take all of these sensible qualities away from the apple, all these secondary qualities away from the apple. Well, what idea are you left with? Nothing. Nothing. Okay, so if removing all of the sensible qualities away from something just results in nothing, then what must objects be? Objects themselves must just be bundles of sensible qualities here. So again, John Locke says a substance, kind of just as a generic bearer of properties, a substance is whatever you are left with when you remove all the sensible qualities away from a particular object. But when you remove all the sensible qualities away from a particular object, you don't have any idea remaining. So we have no idea what a substance is then. So if we understand substance as a generic bearer of properties, it just follows that we have no freaking clue what a substance is. So it must just be the case then that objects are nothing more than bundles of perception. So that is the closest idea of, empirically speaking, it's the closest idea that we can come to as to what a substance is. So Hume would say, Locke, if by substance you mean a generic bearer of properties, whatever you are left with when you remove all sensible qualities away from a thing, I have no idea what you were talking about. Why? Because I have no idea of such a thing. I possess no sensation. I possess no idea of a generic bearer of properties. And again, and think about it, if our language, if our meaningful language is dependent upon experience, such that a failure to trace our language back to a sensation or an idea, which is itself a sensation, if our language can't be traced back to sensations, then this undermines its meaning, which is why Hume would say, when you talk about a substance as a generic bearer of properties, I literally have no idea what you are talking about. I don't know what you mean when you say that. All right. Okay, now where does Berkeley go wrong? So Berkeley goes wrong in particular with several things. So first of all, on this active power in the mind and the spirit. So Berkeley thinks that objects, artifacts and things like that, things in the world are just bundles of ideas, bundles of sensible qualities, but Berkeley does not extend that same consideration to you and I. So Berkeley thinks that you and I are minds, you and I are souls, we are unified mental substances. But Hume is saying, okay, well, wait a minute. Well, wait a minute. If we can extend this notion of what an object is to just be a bundle of sensations, then Hume thinks about, all right, what am I doing when I think about the kind of thing that I am? All right, when I think about the kind of thing that I am, I recognize that I have no idea of myself independently of my own feelings and desires and states of will and states of emotion and states of sensation. Okay, so if all of my acquaintance with myself is when I, whatever this I is desiring something or feeling something or loving something or hating something or sensing something, if this is the very notion of what I refer to when I use the word I, well, if objects in the world are bundles of sensations, then I myself, so far as I can tell, am just a bundle of sensations, or at the very least, that's the only understanding I have about myself empirically. Okay, so that's what's really interesting about, despite their disagreements with Descartes and Berkeley and Locke, they all have this notion of ourselves as unified mental substances. So Berkeley, Hume thinks, Berkeley didn't have the courage to extend his reasoning about, the abstract and the particular and sensations and ideas. He didn't have the courage to apply that to the self. So Berkeley thinks that you and I have knowledge of ourselves in terms of our being unified spirits or souls or minds. Okay. Now, but if the only acquaintance I have with myself is as a collection of various conscious states or a collection of various sensations, Hume says empirically, you don't get a unified thinking substance. You don't get a unified mental thing from this collection of sensations. That, and so far as I can tell, that's all I am. Okay. Secondly, on our knowledge of God, again, so Hume not only questions, all right, well, if I don't have knowledge of myself as a unified mental substance or spirit, I have no idea what it would mean to have knowledge of God as kind of a perfect substance or a perfect spirit. And then again, he'll push back on this notion that we actually have direct access to objects in the world. Now, this is really important. That is how Berkeley avoids skepticism. That is how Berkeley avoids skepticism. So if perception is reality, then skepticism is false. So Hume, in pushing back on this and saying, no, I don't have direct access to objects in the world. The only thing I have direct access to are my own ideas. He agrees with Berkeley on that. Where he disagrees is on the skeptical conclusions here. Okay. All right. Now, so as a result of all this, what Hume is ultimately going to say is that there are only two types of knowledge possible, and all of his skepticism is largely driven by this. So if he's correct on this, that there are only two types of knowledge possible, that means that anything which does not fit into either category, we just adopt a skeptical attitude about. So if Hume is correct that these are the only two types of knowledge, then anything which doesn't fit, can't be shown to fit into these two categories, we just draw the conclusion that we don't possess knowledge of it then. Okay, so the first category is a relation of ideas. So these would be things like math, logic, and synonymous definition. All right, so a relation of ideas is such that its denial results in a self-contradiction. So examples of this would be, all green grass is green. A equals A, 2 plus 2 equals 4. All bachelors are unmarried men. So these are all true, right? And why do we know they're true? Well, because all these things correspond to is the way that we use words. If you know what the word bachelor is, you know what the word unmarried man is, right? This is just linguistic. It's synonymous definition, right? If you know what the word grass means and you know what the word green means, you know all green grass is green. Okay, so more technically, what's happening with relations of ideas is the predicate. So let's just use the statement, all green grass is green. So the subject, green grass, and the predicate, green, well, that predicate is already self-contained within the subject. It expresses the same idea. All bachelors are unmarried men. Well, that's a definition. So I can say all unmarried men are bachelors and all bachelors are unmarried men and communicate the same proposition. So the very notion of an unmarried man, that's just what the word bachelor means. 2 plus 2 equals 4 terminates 4 equals 4. A equals A. Brilliant, right? Okay, that's why these things are self-contradictory. So we know them by reason, but Hume makes this qualification. None of these things are interesting. None of these things are interesting. Hume says no relation of ideas attempts to inform the understanding. of the world. So when I say all green grass is green, logically, that does not imply the existence of grass. It also does not imply the existence of anything green. Or, I use this example when we talk about Hume's moral skepticism in my ethics class. All figatigabigaboos are figatigabigaboos. True or false? All figatigabigaboos are figatigabigaboos. Well, that is true. Now, but do I have any idea what the hell a figatigabigaboos is? No, I don't have a clue. It's just something I made up. Now, but why do I know this is a true statement? Because the subject and predicate are the exact same thing. So all of these things are true, but it's not like they're telling you anything interesting about the way the world is. Okay, so what does that mean then? The logical implication here is that no interesting things are justified by reason. We do not have any interesting knowledge about the world on the basis of reason. We know nothing interesting about the way the world is through reason. Now, but if you think about rationalistic metaphysics, the kind of thing that Rene Descartes is doing, Descartes thinks, oh no, we know lots of interesting things on the basis of our reason. I have knowledge of myself as a unified thinking substance by reason. I have knowledge of God by reason. I've got the ontological argument and the causal argument and so on. So this idea that we can do rational speculative metaphysics, Hume says, no, we can't. All right, so what kind of metaphysics about reality, what that kind of speculative metaphysics would require, it would require our ability to make interesting assertions that are not justified or that are justified by reason, and Hume doesn't think we're going to be able to find any. So anything that is justified by reason, its denial would result in a contradiction, and anything the denial of which results in a contradiction is not interesting. Okay, so speculation about causation, speculation about God's existence, miracles in the afterlife, and all these other kinds of things that we think we have rational knowledge of, Hume says, no, nothing interesting follows here. Okay, now the second type of knowledge is a matter of fact. So a matter of fact would be anything that corresponds to perceptible qualities of things, anything that corresponds to sensation. Okay, now, but when it comes to things that we make judgments about through sensation, their denial is not contradictory. So I'm not contradicting myself when I say the wall is not white. I'm not contradicting myself when I say I am not wearing glasses, my sweater is not blue. This is not an obvious contradiction in the same sense that all green grass is not green or no green grass, right? Some green grass is not green. That is an obvious self-contradiction. Okay, but the wall is not white, that's not a contradiction. My sweater is not blue, that is not a contradiction. The sun will not rise tomorrow, that is not a contradiction. Okay, now, but since the denial of a matter of fact does not result in a contradiction, that means that any matter of fact could always be different than the way we experience it. So again, just because the sun rose today doesn't mean that it will rise tomorrow. So past experience, repeated observation does not give me any grounds whatsoever to make judgment about the future. Okay. I don't have any knowledge of causation. Why? Because causes imply necessary connections between things, right? So, if I say, if I drop the pen will fall, I'm presupposing that there's a necessary connection between two events, but necessary connections cannot be established by experience. Okay, so with our matters of fact, we at least are attempting to describe the way things are, but we need to keep in mind that our descriptions are going to be, whoa, what that? So I can't say that because something fell off my desk that it made a loud bang. For all I know, these are completely causally unrelated events. They, they're closely correlated in space and time as far as I can tell, but I have no grounds to say whatsoever that one caused the other. Right. So what we need to keep in mind with matters of fact, however, is that what we're doing is describing our sensations. Okay. So, and what Hume does here is he thinks that we need to reanalyze our understanding of causation in terms of this. Okay. So if I say, you know, all gases expand when heated under constant pressure, you know, I state that as as a physical law, right? All gases expand when heated under constant pressure. That presupposes that sort of law governed regularity presupposes that since it has happened in the past, it will happen in the future. Yeah, but what I ought to do is just redefine what I'm saying here. So the only thing I can say is this: I can't say all gases expand when heated under constant pressure as a matter of necessity. All I can say is this: all observed instances of gases being heated under constant pressure are observed instances of gases expanding. So all observed instances of gases being heated under constant pressure are observed instances of gases expanding. So we're still doing pretty good here, all right? Okay. Now, so it is for that reason that Hume is a skeptic about all that big long list of things that I already mentioned: the existence of God, the reliability of belief about the future, causation, the substantiality of the self, miracles and the afterlife. You know, the idea of that we have moral knowledge. All of this has to go. All of this is well beyond our kin to know. Okay. All right. So that will do it for now. I hope you enjoyed this brief presentation and have a little more clarity on what Hume is actually talking about. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. Thanks, y'all.